Hi, Bill. You're on mute.
It's your show now.
Okay. I want to apologize first if I freeze or sort of the picture shudders. I'm recording the two different audio streams as well to put up on the website later, and I think my internet is starting to struggle at this point. So this session is going to be the academic panel. So we have several academics joining us today with slightly different disciplines, a range of disciplines and slightly different perspectives on the sort of questions around MLM. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Stacey Bosley. She's an economist and she has worked with the FTC on the economics of MLM. Our second speaker will be Dr. Claudia Gross. She studies educational design and looks at building more ethical organizations. Dr. Heidi Lu looks at the intersection between behavioral economics and law. And finally, Dr. Andrew Stivers is an economist who is currently a deputy director at the FTC. And they're going to talk to you a little bit about their own work. And folks, if you go past kind of 15 minutes, I'm going to start waving frantically at you. So I will let Stacey take it away. Can you share your screen with us, Stacey? Are you?
I can. Thank
Great.
you, Maura. Can everyone see that? Yes, excellent. Well, thank you for having me. It's, again, a really interesting day and couple of days that I'm really appreciative to, again, steering committee, the College of New Jersey, and Bill Keep, again, in particular, for really spearheading this. I want to sort of explain the motivation for my approach today, and that is that I'm trained in applied economics, which has a very strong data focus. And so as I started to think about researching this industry, one of the first questions that I had to think about was where I might find data that might be useful for this. And as you might imagine, it's not necessarily easy depending on the industry or the environment that you're trying to study. So obviously surveys would be one possibility. I'm helping with some of the follow-on analysis that the AARP survey is leading to, as that some of you may be familiar with their survey regarding multi-level marketing. And of course, there's industry trade data as well. There is, again, for publicly traded companies, you might look to financial reports. We've heard a lot today about complaint data from the Consumer Sentinel Network and others. But the things that I'm going to focus on today are going to be the use of economic experiments and how we've tried to use that to create our own data in a way and learn some things that might be difficult to uncover otherwise. And then also I want to speak a little bit to the use of case data for the purpose of academic research. So first, when it comes to experiments, just in case, for this is a broad audience, and I want to be sure that it's sort of clear what the pros and cons are of using an experimental approach are. First of all, I mean, you're able to control for so many confounding variables that operate on us as decision makers in our normal environments. So we know that there's so many competing factors that are affecting our judgments and our decisions. How do we isolate the impact of certain factors? And that's where a controlled environment can really help with that. You also, through a randomized control trial approach, can actually get to causality. You can design an experiment in such a way that you randomly allocate your individuals or subjects across those groups in a way that actually allows you to get to, again, a strong potential correlation, or beyond correlation, to a strong causal explanation of what might be affecting, again, changes in judgment or decision making. And normally, economists observe the sort of the final act we make, whether we pick something up and buy it at a grocery store, or what we ultimately do regarding a mortgage. But we often can't explore sort of the underlying decision-making processes that lead to those final outcomes. And an experiment does give you the opportunity to try to dig in a little bit and figure out, again, what that might look like. And then, we've got measurement issues in sort of every type of data that we have, but in situations of consumer protection, those issues might be incredibly large. As we've heard today, there's a lot of silence around people's experiences. So even when you solicit information, it may not be, fully accurate. There's all kinds of things that, again, might get in the way. And so when you're observing people in a lab environment, you can bypass some of those measurement issues. But because you actually get to observe what they actually do in front of you. On the other hand, the lab, especially a lab environment for an experiment, is not the field. It cannot fully represent the actual environment in which people are making their decisions. And so it has obvious limitations that are, sort of the counterpoint to the advantages. Sometimes we can only get at consumers' intentions. We can't necessarily actually watch what they actually do in terms of actual behavior. And even if we can give them an environment where they can make an active choice, as we've done in some of our experiments, even then they know they're observed, right? And so it's still not the field or the real life context in full. We also know that when we do an experiment, the sample that we choose or who agrees to participate, for example, might lead to selection bias in our results. And we know we have to do replication in order to deal with internal validity and external validity issues, which I'll talk about in a moment. So just to give you a peek at one of the experiments that we've done, we have done an experiment in disclosure. And just to understand, as we've talked about a lot today, there are issues of representation of likely earnings in multi-level marketing. And we wanted to try to understand what is the role potentially of a voluntary income disclosure, and does that affect consumer judgment and decision-making? Because what we know, just like calorie labels or other disclosures, information that might be disclosed to somebody at the time of making a decision may or may not have an impact, right? We might ignore it. We might affect different people in different ways. And so there's, to our knowledge, this was the first research that had looked at the disclosures that are used by multi-level marketing companies, which are not required, but in the United States, but are voluntarily adopted by some firms. Who adopts them? What is their design? And what, if anything, can we learn about the impact of these disclosures? And so again, we chose to study this in an experimental environment. We started by giving all of our subjects, we had in this case about 270 subjects that participated. I'll say a little bit more about extensions we're doing to this work. But this initial study was actually using university students, which is a common first step for academic experiments. And all of the participants saw an opportunity video and website screenshots from an actual multi-level marketing firm. And then the control group received no additional information. They did not receive an income disclosure. The first treatment group did receive an income disclosure, and I've sort of anonymized it here as it is also in the paper, the published paper. But this group did receive a document that had been produced by the company itself as an income disclosure. Again, it did not include expenses, had some of the issues that we've heard about in terms of only reporting the numbers for active participants. So, it's what we might consider not to be a full and proper disclosure, but did disclose numbers and additional information. We also tried a second treatment, which was a graphical simplified treatment where we basically limited the amount of information to the percentage of people that fell in different income categories. And again, we wanted to see if these things would have an impact on consumer interest and consumer judgment in terms of their likely earnings expectations. And I won't take time because time is limited to go through our full findings, but we did find that in fact, the treatment groups on average had much lower earnings expectations when you ask them about their typical expectations for what they would earn in this multi-level marketing company. So to give you an example, that on average, the control group subjects reported that they thought they would earn about $11,000 in revenue, where the average across the treatments was that that number fell to closer to $3,000 to $4,000. So a significant reduction in what they thought they might earn. Now, this is not a full reduction all the way to sort of the objective, for example, expected value, which would have been about $1,500 before expenses. But it still did cause a pretty large drop in their earnings expectations. Again, I want to emphasize that in order to validate this, we would need to, and we are replicating this experiment on other subjects, but we also, again, know that it faces all the limitations I mentioned earlier, that it's in a lab environment. It did not replicate the interpersonal nature of the way in which people are often presented this information. We also asked them to consciously consider their earnings and provided them with the disclosure information in this kind of cool decision-making environment. And so again, does not necessarily represent, and we would never suggest that it does represent exactly what a disclosure would do in the real world. But it is one step toward trying to learn what that might look like. So our extension so far, just to give you an understanding of sort of where we then take research like this, is we've now adopted a very similar experiment with about 600 subjects in Amazon's Mechanical Turk environment. These are people who do kind of gig work by definition when they take on studies and other projects for pay. And so again, this is a little bit obviously different environment than our university subjects. We also considered the role of order effects. These things can impact people's answers. So do you ask them about their interest first and then what they expect to earn, or do you ask them about what they expect to earn and then their interest? And so we're testing things like order effects. We're also, again, trying to look for differences in how the same disclosure might affect different people in different ways. And that's incredibly important. At a minimum, you sort of want to do no harm with disclosure, presumably. And so we're looking to see, again, if there's any unintended consequences from disclosure. We've seen in the field, for example, that sometimes disclosures are used by MLM firms as a marketing device, pointing to the top earnings as sort of evidence of success without necessarily indicating the likelihood of that success. And we're also considering the role we got a lot of academic feedback that there was potential interest in exploring the better than average effect. Do people report differently or process this information differently based on how they think they would perform in this environment relative to the average person? And this is, and I'm going to, again, emphasize something that Katie Deffin said earlier, we need more people doing this research, and ultimately that could lead to more capacity for experts in this field. And one of the environments that I think would be really interesting is for people who do field experiments to get involved in this area. The closer we can move these lab experiments to, again, real world sort of circumstances and think creatively about how to do that, I think there's a lot of room for research in this area. And I will also just speak briefly to what case data I think can do. And so again, of course, as a result of enforcement actions or other inquiries, the federal government and other governmental agencies may have case data that might be incredibly useful to researchers under the right conditions, right, where certain conditions are met, that this is an appropriate use of data. And so I just want to give you some insight into what we've been doing with some data of that type. So we have data on Fortune High Tech Marketing, which was sued by multiple states and then ultimately sued by the Federal Trade Commission in concert with, again, additional states, and ultimately settled the case in 2014, effectively leading to their closure. This is about data on about 500,000 individuals across the country. And while this scheme is relatively small, and again, presented themselves as a multi-level marketing firm, but allegations were that it acted as a pyramid scheme and misrepresented earnings. And again, we don't have data on who they are, but we know where they were and when they joined. And that alone is enough to help us try to uncover some things about things that might be playing out. Why did people in different places join at different rates? And so we're particularly interested in this study in looking at issues of strain and opportunity, also partnering with a criminal justice professor to kind of think about this from a perspective of victimization. And so we're looking at county level analysis, and we're using an approach called group trajectory models, which allow you to try to group different, in this case, counties into different groups based on the trajectory of their adoption curve. So, who were early adopters, who were late adopters, but took it on in a big way later in the life of the scheme. By the way, this was, again, operational from 2001 on, so approximately a 12-year life for this company. And then once you've divided counties into trajectories, then you try to predict the factors that will lead to group membership, right? And so the idea is to uncover, again, sources of vulnerability at a community level that might help to identify opportunities for education and, again, areas of vulnerability. So just to give you again, this is not published research yet, this is in progress, but this is an image of the groups as they stand right now. And you can see the gray bar represents a recessionary period. And so we have this currently grouped into low adopters. Again, if I haven't mentioned it, this reached about 96% of the counties of the 3,000 counties in the United States, approximately 3,000 counties. So it had huge reach, even though it was relatively small. But we do see a group that had low adoption for the entire time. We see, again, a group that reacted incredibly strongly to the Great Recession. We see the early adopters. And now we are analyzing, again, the predictions, sort of the predicting factors that would lead to group membership, which include things like the Social Vulnerability Index that the CDC publishes, which is increasingly being used to understand the vulnerability of communities to external shocks like natural disasters or the coronavirus. We're looking at things like social capital variables that might, again, either help protect a community or might actually serve as a form of opportunity, right? Because of the person-to-person engagement, which this requires. So that just gives you a sense of where we're at. And I would just say that, I would really love to talk to any researchers who are interested in this space. I think we need much more interest in this, again, type of research. We need varied perspectives. We need resources, but in fact, a lot of these experiments, for example, take very little money to implement. It's not something that you would apply for a large grant for. And so even small sources of funding are very useful here. And access and partnerships, of course, to case data, but also, if you're working on education, we have an education experiment going right now as well. Partnering with the FTC or the CFPB would be incredibly valuable to academic researchers. And then, of course, patience, because some of this research takes time, especially longitudinal experiments. So that's all I have, and I will look forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Stacey. I have to admit, I was a little starstruck when I met Stacey first because I had read all her work and was very impressed by it. So our next speaker is someone else whose work I had read a lot of, and this is Dr. Claudia Gross. I know I'm not saying it right, but I'm doing my best, Claudia. And she's going to talk to us a little bit about organizational design.
Yeah, and I will share my screen. So, can you see my screen?
Yes.
I guess so. Yeah. So thank you very much for your kind introduction. So I wrote my PhD on multi-level marketing in more than a decade ago, and this was in business administration. And while my PhD was not about ethics, the number of ethical problems I saw was that striking that I decided to dig deeper. And today I want to talk about why the ethical problems of MLMs persist. So why do so many distributors still lose instead of earn money? And why do distributors still make excessive and even illegal health claims, product claims? And why do that many MLM organizations have a culture that is cult-like? So I will give you my personal opinion based on research why this happens. And while there are many answers to these questions, and I love Robert's book, Poncenomics, I want to highlight today one core insight, and that's an insight inspired by organization theory. So my name is Claudia Gross, and I work at the Department of Organizational Design and Development, which is at the Nijmegen School of Management. This is in the Netherlands. So the goal is to see what can we learn from an organization theory perspective. And what we can learn and what I want to show is that institutional rules and regulations do not cover well how MLMs work. They might cover well traditional companies, but MLMs are different. The perspective I want to present is transnational and generic. So we have heard a lot of important details how different states and countries regulate central points in their laws. But this perspective is different. I really take an abstract view, a generic perspective on how MLMs work. My focus is on MLMs that have consumer products. So first I want to explain what is actually an organization theory perspective. Organization theory reflects on how organizations are set up. This includes the structure. So who does what in an organization? So who is responsible for recruiting new members? And who educates them? Who socializes them? Who teaches them how to work? Does management do that? Or is this done by self-employed contractors? What is the culture of an organization? What are values that are propagated? Are the values we offer great products and enjoy working here? Or is it the products will save the world and who does not join is a loser? HR and incentives are important. So what are people paid for? Are you paid per hour? Are you paid for giving advice? Are you paid for selling products or for recruiting? Organizational theory has more aspects, but we'll keep on those because they can tell us about a core thing for today, namely who is responsible and accountable if misbehavior occurs. To understand how MLMs work, it makes sense to first understand how traditional organization works. So this can be a car manufacturer, a drugstore chain, or a shoe retailer. It does not matter that much. The basic idea is that an organization has a management and has organizational members, employees. If it's a very big organization with different plants, different locations, it will have a headquarters, but the structure keeps the same, management and the employees. So let's take now a small drugstore. Let's assume an employee of the drugstore tells a consumer that the nutritional supplements that they sell here will heal cancer or protect from COVID-19. In this structure, the employee, the salesperson, will very soon get problems with the managers of the drugstore. And the reason is that here we have consumer protection rules, and the organization as a whole is responsible that behavior of employees to the outside is correct. Yeah. So the implication is for illegal product claims that they might happen, but if they happen, we know who is responsible. And this is management and headquarters. At the same time, employees do not only have duties, they also have rights. So we have labor laws, and these labor laws will ensure that people are paid appropriately. What appropriate is differs a lot between countries, and there are many problems, especially in poor countries, that people are paid far too little. But the very situation that most organizational members here of such an organization invest more than they earn would still be really striking. It would be really wondrous because there are these labor laws. Okay. And if a culture of an organization is cult-like and causes problems with families and friends of the members or with society, we would also know to find those who are responsible, namely management and headquarters. Okay. So having had a look at this, let's have a look at how MLMs are structured and organized. So the first thing we see is the core organization actually only entails the headquarters. The selling of products is done by these organizational members that are independent. So they are members and they are not really members because they're independent contractors. So if they do the selling to non-members, these consumer protection rules still exist. So illegal health claims are still illegal. The difference is that this relation is not that well protected. And even though it's still illegal to make health claims, this relationship is not that well monitored. Now, I was very pleased to hear that in Canada, and Andrew Smith talked about that in the morning, also actions were taken against independent distributors who made these health claims. But very often what we see is that the monitoring of these promises is not very good because they are made on private social media accounts, in the living room, on the schoolyard, in the tennis club, or wherever. So here, MLM headquarters seem to be insufficiently accountable for what is going on here. At the same time, the distributors are also not protected by labor laws. Yeah. So the implications for illegal product claims is that, organizations adhere officially to these laws, but here we see elements that are different from a traditional organization, and that most distributors invest more than they earn. Yeah, that's the pity, because here these people are not employees, they are independent distributors, so they cannot really fall back to the organization. I want to add an extra layer, how MLMs work, because MLMs do not rely simply on individual distributors. They rely on whole distributor networks. So what we can see here is these independent distributors form an upline and downline system. And this distributor network is responsible for quite some tasks that normally headquarters do. So it's responsible for recruiting people, for educating people, for socializing people, for telling people how to recruit others, how to sell the product, what to believe. And the upline and the downline members tell each other the same thing. So here these ideals and values take place, and are repeated. 3 aspects are central now. First, here headquarters outsources tasks and responsibilities, but they don't seem very accountable for what is going on here. Yeah, that's the second point. So first the outsourcing, but the accountability is difficult because they are all independent. And the third is that also within the upline and downline system, labor laws do not apply, because again, everyone is independent. So when we look at this, we can see that while for a traditional organization, in terms of illegal product claims, this relation is relevant, here we all see kind of other relations that simply do not exist. And the implications are that a cult-like culture and all these claims about excessive income, they come often from here, but they are not well monitored. The last layer I want to add is what happens when problems are made public, when complaints pile up, or when a media report takes place. What happens is that headquarters points out that their official website is really fine, that they do not make these huge income claims, and that they have product descriptions that make very clear that the products might soothe something or might have a certain value, but they don't heal cancer. Yeah? So only very few MLMs would put these illegal things on their website. Headquarters also point out that they have codes of ethics, code of conduct, and nice guidelines that all read very well. And by doing all these statements about what headquarters do, actually the core problem is covered up. Because for me, the core problem from an organizational theory perspective is that we have here several relations that are not well regulated. Okay. So what can we learn from an organization theory perspective? First, it's a transnational and generic perspective. It's abstract. It does not go into the details of different countries' laws. And countries do differ, as we have also seen today, in their rules and regulations, and also MLMs differ. But what we can learn is that MLMs have a very unique organizational form. They are not traditional organizations. They have a different structure, a very particular culture, and an incentive system that is unknown to other companies. What they do is that this setup actually allows a source of outsourcing of tasks. And by giving these tasks to the distributor network, also the accountability that is regulated and organized for normal organizations within the headquarters is a kind of outsourced. So the accountability and responsibility for misbehavior becomes unclear. So what I want to argue is that governmental rules and regulations for traditional organizations often do not cover untraditional organizations. They do not cover quite some organizations of the gig economy, but they also do not cover well MLMs. And this also means that legal is something very different from ethical. So the fact that most MLMs have not been prosecuted anywhere around the world does not mean that headquarters really takes care to monitor what's going on here. Yeah? So legal is not the same as ethical. If we want that these relations do not cause problems, then we need far more specific governmental rules and regulations that really look at these particular situation that does not exist in traditional organizations. And in particular, and here we see the core, this distributor network, the accountability for what is done here needs to be regulated. So, from an organization theory perspective, the situation is pretty dire. But laws can change and organizations can change, and they also can be put under public scrutiny so that they want to change. And that's why I'm very pleased and grateful that this first Consumer Protection Conference is taking place. And I want to thank William Keep and the whole steering committee and all those who helped making this work. Thank you, and thank you for watching.
Thank you so much, Claudia. Yes, I'm actually presenting myself tomorrow from a marketing and advertising perspective on how messages percolate within the network. So I hope Claudia and I can have a chat after that as well. Our next speaker is Dr. Heidi Lu, and I had not read Heidi's work until she was suggested as a panelist, and then I read it and absolutely loved it. I'm wondering what other wonderful things I've missed now. So Heidi, why don't you tell us a little bit about your work?
Sure. Thank you for having me and inviting me. And I have to thank Dr. Bosley as well. I think she's really an inspiration to a lot of researchers in this field. And so we actually share a similar disciplinary field, which is behavioral economics, which I would consider the application of psychological principles and behavioral insights to the standard economic model. And so the talk that I'm going to give today is a little less experimental and a little bit more theoretical. And it's about putting in language that helps us contextualize a lot of the behaviors that consultants might face when they are considering whether to join or whether to stay in an MLM program. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see here. And can you see this all right?
Yes, that looks great, Heidi.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Great. So as part of my background, I study uncertainty and risk, and I'm trained both as an attorney and as a behavioral economist, as I mentioned earlier. And so this research that I'm presenting is a little bit earlier, and so it dates prior to my affiliation with my current academic institution. I want to start out with a couple of assumptions. First, I just want to be kind of clear with where I'm coming from, which is that I think that some LMMs might be pyramid schemes and some might not be. And the line between permissible and impermissible, or legal or illegal, is really subject to jurisdictions and regulation. Since other panels are going to go into the regulatory scheme of LMMs, I'm not going to talk much from my lawyer hat right now. I'm mostly going to focus on my academic work and how behavioral economics concepts might play into this. And so, you know, as I've mentioned before, behavioral economics studies how behavioral minds might systematically differ from the cost-benefit analysis that we're often talking about in traditional economics. So in order to talk through this, I'm going to sort of talk about what a consumer would think about in terms of joining or staying in an MLM under a rational model, and then what happens in a behaviorally realistic model. So to be clear, when I say rational, it's not a value-laden term. It just really means when a individual acts in a way that's consistent with mainstream or traditional economic frameworks. It's probably easier to show this by comparison. So by way of example, let me take you through what a standard economic framework might look like with regard to MLMs versus a behaviorally informed model. And again, really this paper and this presentation is really trying to get a look and to contextualize and give language to some of the behaviors that consultants might engage in. So in behavioral economics, we like to talk about Homo economicus, which is just a fancy word for the economic man or woman, versus Homo sapiens, aka people. And in neoclassical economics, we use this term to generate, models of how people behave. And models are helpful because they help us to generate further theories, which is something that you're seeing right now in all of these really wonderful academic panels. So here's some examples. Under the theory of sort of a standard economic man, we sort of think that people take into account all the information that's out there, or they're willing to not take it if it's really hard to find that information. We think that people on average have pretty good self-control. They say what they're going to do and they're going to follow up on it, or they're comfortable with their choice to put it off. And most importantly in economics, incentives are king. So what that means is that people think about what their payoffs are and they act accordingly. So we might expect the economic man or woman to act accordingly, right? And so what does that look like when someone is considering joining an MLM? Well, people will sort of think about the costs and benefits from an economic perspective. They might think about how much they're going to earn in sales, how much the startup package is going to be. And they might think about non-economic costs and benefits. And I know that, Moira's work touches on this in terms of gender. People might want to be involved in traditional market labor if they've stepped away from the workplace, for instance, with mothers and primary caregivers. People might want to be involved in a community, which is something that I think MLMs provide quite a bit of. And so here are the questions that you might see from a cost-benefit analysis perspective. As I mentioned before, people might think about how much they're going to make in sales and the costs and who they would reach out to. And of course, I'm talking about the subset of direct selling that focuses on a large portion of commissions coming from other consultants. But what I'd like to posit here today is that these questions are really hard. And in fact, I take a bit of a larger approach, which is to say that I think all cost benefit is quite difficult in many contexts. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, these questions are a lot harder than we might like to think or MLM consultants might want to think. And what's really important here is that the gap between knowing how these questions are difficult leads us to underestimate them. So let me turn to a behavioral model. Over the past 40 or 50 years, economics and psychologists have really created this robust framework of experiments and data sets that show systematic differences from the assumptions that I've talked about before. There's a really great lineage of interesting experiments and behaviors. And, I think a lot of the really high potential, right, in this field is really translating that work to the specific context of MLMs and to think about it with all sorts of methodological innovations. So traditional economics, don't get me wrong, are really quite useful. But we do have these tools of field experiments and lab experiments. So in contrast to having pretty good optimization, I think it's safe to say that the literature really shows that, people don't optimize that well. And that is really determined by the limited attention and the limited cognitive capacity that we all have. And I think we also engage in biased thinking from time to time. And so we see in these experiments systematic predictable errors in how we calculate how likely something will occur, for instance. And specifically, I'm saying we overestimate how good our odds are. And instead of pretty good self-control, I think we all might have imperfect self-control. I don't think I'm saying anything new here with regard to this point. I woke up this morning and thought I was going to work out, and really I just didn't. And lastly, when we think about people maximizing their utility, we think that people are really driven by payoffs. But I think that, it is true, and we see this in the literature. People think about others when they're making their decisions and how those other people might benefit, or how social interactions with other people feed into what they want. That's prosociality, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think the real takeaway is that we often think that our decisions are influenced by incentives and that we're able to weigh those things correctly. But honestly, I think we're really influenced by situations, and we're influenced by context in a way that we may not always be aware of, or in a way that we sort of discount. So that has implications for potential recruits into MLMs, and I'll walk through some examples here. So looking at imperfect optimization, what I would say is that we might expect confusion about expected economic benefits. So I've included this photo here because of a study that was done in 2005 about choice overload more broadly. And so that study suggests that when people are taking a lot of jam samples in the grocery store, they get really overwhelmed by choice and they just kind of walk away from the station. But people who have a limited set of constraints or parameters to look at end up making marginally better decisions. But I think the process of recruitment in an MLM can be really complex, right? You enter the MLM, you have these startup packages, and then you have fees on the back end. And so that can be a little bit difficult to calculate, and I think people have a hard time predicting what they want. They engage in something that we call base rate neglect and optimism. And so although many people lose money from joining an MLM, they think that they might be one of the exceptions. And there's also a documented paraphenomena called present bias and projection bias. In present bias, you don't think as much about future costs. You're really thinking about the present and what your benefits might be from now. And this is something that's really seen in other important domains, just like retirement savings and public health. And in projection bias, you sort of think that your future won't be sort of changed over time. And so in this case, you might project the effects of success and really kind of focusing and anchoring on that really prospectus future. And so it just makes it really hard to prepare enough for the future. But I think the thing is that even if you engage in these sort of cognitive biases, as we might call them, when you don't have information on the costs or benefits, it's really easy to be over optimistic. And so when I was examining several MLMs recruitment materials for my work, I noticed that they didn't mention consultant costs or revenue. So the costs come much later in the form of account maintenance fees, in the form of maybe below inventory ordering. And when I look at figures about revenue, it's not about the average cost, it's really about individual testimonials. And people love stories, but when you're joining something with a really big outlay, that sort of requires aggregate data. Now, people also have imperfect self-control. When advertising is effective, it might convince you to do something and to do things in the heat of the moment. And finally, other regarding preferences. When I say other regarding preferences or non-standard preferences, I'm making a call back to the point that, people aren't in it for themselves. They're really thinking about other people in that regard. And what I would say here is that a lot of the marketing in these situations for MLMs that maybe are on kind of the legal fringe is that they really co-opt language that is really meant to dovetail with who you want to be as a person. I think that's often true of advertising, but this is especially true here. And so I would argue specifically that in a very uniquely American flavor, a lot of this language is really about the American dream, right? And about becoming a better person. And so the two values that I look at when I look through these materials are about grit and independence. And I sort of make the claim that these are values that we think about in American civil religion. Civil religion sort of being like a country's national values that are kind of upheld to the level of religion, but distinct from it. And so, I consider grit as one example. Grit is sort of the belief that your work, your effort is correlated with your outcomes. And then independence, right? I think that understandably consultants join for not necessarily to be part of a organization as an employee, but to really go out for themselves and be an entrepreneur. And the thing is, when you have those two values working in tandem, it can cause some issues. If you think that effort is perfectly correlated with performance, it allows you to ignore a lot of structural issues. You can imagine that there might be gender or race disparities in terms of how much people are able to sell if people feel biased about a consultant. But if you consider grit as the countervailing balance to that, then you're saying that this is really entirely meritocratic. And so if you're underselling things, then that's really your individual fault. And in the same way, independence really counters that, because if you're looking for help or looking to maybe get out of that sort of situation, it's sort of adding fuel to the flames of just self-blame. And so these values are really important because they sustain a lot of the social norms that occur in some of the more problematic sort of scenarios. If you're leaving the situation, you might continue to blame yourself. If your community is really tied to others in the organization, then it's really hard to leave without losing your community as well. And so you can imagine that grit sustains MLM consultants' optimism in the face of losses, which become, I think, more likely as we are seeing from the data. Whereas this idea of having independence really reduces the emphasis on economic losses altogether, because now you're saying, well, I didn't join for the gains, I really joined for the community. Again, I think it's important to note, why is this different from general marketing and advertising? I think it really has to do with the high cost of being involved in the organization. And I don't think, this is necessarily a knock on people. I think that this psychology is really normal to folks. And so when I think about the cost benefit analysis questions we've been talking about before, I think that, people underestimate how much they're going to make. They underestimate the costs. And they also might have a skewed vision of who they're able to recruit. And that comes from more time with founders. So I want to just say one last thing in terms of policy, which is that I think the really important thing is actually disclosure. Again, under an economic model, we think that people have up-to-date information, but the fact that people join the organization, maybe don't profit, and then suddenly decide that it's about the community suggests that behavioral biases play a factor. And so I think at the end of the day, this is really a question, as I said again, about disclosure. We should be able to give people information in a way that they can understand, so that they can really behave in a way that aligns with the interests that they want in the long term. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heidi. That was wonderful. I might just mention to you, I think possibly your sweater is making contact with your microphone. So just for the Q&A, you might have a look at that. And then our final panelist on this panel will be Dr. Andrew Stivers, as I mentioned, currently at the FTC. And Andrew's work is, well, I'm a marketer. It's a little tough for me. I had to use a pen and paper and work out the maths, but hopefully Andrew can talk us through it in a very gentle way.
Well, thank you, Maura, and thank you, Bill, and the organizers at the University of New Jersey. As Maura said, I'm an economist, so I approach this from a very, I guess, neoclassical standpoint, in contrast to the last speaker. But before I say anything of substance, I need to tell you that my views are my own. This research reflects my own understanding of what's going on here, and this does not necessarily reflect the views of the commission or any individual commissioner. Okay, so the impetus for this paper came out of, I think, some of the complexities that MLMs and pyramids have, and trying to sort of sort out how they actually operate, and really trying to address the question of what makes an MLM, a legitimate MLM, different from a pyramid. And the follow-on question to that is really, what is the mechanism that makes the risks and harms associated with a pyramid different from a legitimate business opportunity? And what we do here is really try to set down in the simplest possible model how to capture the central characteristics of what distinguishes a pyramid from an MLM, while keeping the story, just very simple. and trying to show people kind of why we need to be concerned at a basic level about pyramids. I think for a lot of folks that's kind of intuitive, but as an economist, it sometimes helps for me to put things down in a model. So I'm not going to go into the technical details of the model. It's, as these things go, not terribly mathematical, but I'm presuming that most of the folks in the audience here are not economists. And so I'm not going to try to present it the way I would necessarily present it to a group of academic economists. So let me just sort of talk about what we say in relatively qualitative terms. So there are 4 characteristics that we take as kind of fundamental to thinking about the organization that we're going to be trying to examine here. And the first thing is that retail selling and recruiting others to sell and to recruit others is central in this organization. The second is that recruitment is going to be incentivized typically these days through some payment related to recruits' purchases. Back in the early days, there were examples of pyramids that just paid directly for recruiting. That was quickly seen as being quite problematic. Most of the pyramids that you see these days do not do that. They pay based on purchase from the company. This is very similar in some respects to what a legitimate MLM will do. Thirdly, you see eligibility for recruitment incentives tied to purchase or volume requirements by the sort of the person doing the recruiting themselves, right? So often there's an expectation that you're going to do a certain amount of selling directly, or your immediate group is going to do a certain amount of selling directly before you're going to be eligible for rewards related to the recruit's sales. And then lastly, rewards are typically tied to product payments to the firm, that is often purchases, rather than reflecting necessarily consumption value or demand for the product themselves. And that's something that you actually see kind of generally across many firms. It's very difficult for a wholesaler or distributor to observe downstream demand, and that's in fact one of the rationales for the MLM distribution system, is that the firm can't observe that downstream demand. And so, of course, it would be very difficult to base payments on something you can't observe. So 1 and 2 capture some of the defining features of what we see in MLMs, where consumption and retail and distribution roles overlap. As I said, observation 4 highlights a feature that is common to a variety of businesses, but it's the combination of observation 3 and 4, as we talk about in the paper, that create a situation where participants are potentially rewarded for purchasing product to meet demand, and sometimes purchasing product to become eligible for the rewards that they would get from their recruits' purchases. So it's that sort of blending of those different incentives that potentially creates a problem, as Andrew Smith and others noted. There is potentially a danger of oversaturation in the market. And so when you have incentives to purchase products that is kind of goes beyond just meeting the demand in front of you, that's potentially a situation that's going to give oversaturation. All right, so with that framework, a potential participant in one of these organizations is going to be considering the gain, the expected profit, from 2 different pieces, right? There's going to be, first of all, the sort of standard retail profit margin. So you're going to be thinking about, well, what can I sell this product for based on the demand that I see around me? And typically that's going to be your network of friends and relations and whatnot. how much do I think I can sell this product for to them versus the wholesale price that the firm is charging me, plus all the related costs of that, plus all the costs of selling that aren't going to be part of that wholesale price. So that's one thing that you're going to be thinking about. Can I make a profit selling this product directly? The other thing you're going to be thinking about is, well, I know based on the compensation plan that I will get rewarded for purchases made by my recruits, but I also know it's costly to recruit people, right? I've got to spend time, I've got to do all of the things it takes to convince somebody to enter and stay in the organization. And so typically what you will see is rewards are given to offset those kinds of costs. So, you're thinking about both of these things. And the last is going to be particularly important because there's always some likelihood of unsuccessful recruiting. And because the firm can't force recruiting effort, it's a classic sort of principal agent model, as we talked about in economics, it needs to reward more than enough it needs to reward enough to offset those potential losses of recruiting in order to make the expectation, at least ahead of time, to make the expectation of that activity profitable. So far, we have the ingredients of a potentially beneficial, mutually or sort of globally profitable venture, right? You can sell product, consumers who want the product, create value. Again, in the economics world, we talk about creating surplus by meeting demand. And the way to do that is to make sure that the cost of distribution, the cost of getting the products to market is less than the willingness to pay of consumers, the value of consumers. And secondly, that the reward for recruiting is such that there's an expected profit, right? That reward is going to offset costs. But given the tied nature, given the bundled nature of the retail sales and the recruiting side of this business, there's going to be some complications. The first is that because there are two avenues of compensation, there's the compensation from one's own purchases, and then there's compensation potentially from one's recruits' purchases. A firm could potentially backload retail profits onto the rewards from recruits' purchases. So this is a classic kind of model that we see in economics, where there are sort of two avenues that you can kind of trade off against each other, right? I can get rewarded in two different ways that are bundled. And so if you're designing a contract, you can potentially kind of shift payment from one to the other. The total payment might be the same, but it does change incentives. So here, theoretically, a firm could charge an absolutely enormous wholesale price for the product, meaning that retail sales would be necessarily at a loss, but then they could boost the rewards associated with the purchase, somebody else's purchase of the product, somebody else's purchase of the wholesale price, in order to offset that, right? So in that situation, it could be that even though the retail sale viewed by itself occurs at a loss, the overall expectation of profit is going to be positive. Now, this by itself might be unfair if it is really transferring wealth, that is losses, from unsuccessful recruiters to successful recruiters, right? By kind of backloading those payments, you're really putting all of the risk on somebody who is not able to recruit, even if they actually find a retail market for their product. So this might be a situation, as long as there's not too much of it, as long as there's a sufficiently valuable product and the wholesale price doesn't necessarily deviate too much from that, and there's robust sustained demand, which, as we've talked about, is another issue, you could potentially have an increase in overall surplus, but it's still going to make a significant fraction of the participants, and mathematically, the majority of participants are going to be unsuccessful in any kind of recruiting scheme with kind of many or one-to-many recruitment. So it potentially could be a real problem. Our paper actually goes further, and it shows that a bad actor can take advantage of overly optimistic participants. And we don't take a stance about why they might be overly optimistic. As the previous speaker pointed out, there could be a variety of behavioral reasons, but this is a complex market. There's also reasons that people just might not have good information. As some of the earlier speakers suggested, there's potentially, again, a principal agent problem where the firm tries to set sets out a fairly strict standard for what can be said, but the individual agents might be tempted to induce these more overly optimistic beliefs about the probability of success. So a bad actor can take advantage of those overly optimistic participants. And in that case, there's really no limit to the wholesale price that could be charged while still getting participation. So the idea is that, if I think it's really likely that I can, say, recruit 2 people, when in actuality, it's quite hard to do, especially in a saturated market, I might agree to participate. So for example, if I tell you that, hey, you pay me $50 and you think that you have greater than 50% chance of recruiting 2 people who would then get you $50 each, you might think, wow, this is a great deal. From a sort of expected payoff standpoint, you're going to come out ahead. Well, but the problem with that is that if you think $50 is a reasonable payment, you should still think that $5,000 is a reasonable payment, right? You can just kind of add zeros, and if it's a net positive for $50, it's going to be a net positive for $5 million. And that creates what we call a money pump situation, which is generally a bad situation because it has the illusion of kind of creating something out of nothing. So when we do that, that obviously is going to de-link any sort of payment from any underlying value of a good that's being traded underneath that. So the upshot of all this, and I'll just wrap up here, the upshot of all this is that participant beliefs are a key part of the concern here, and something that regulators in particular need to be very careful about and thinking about, as well as industry players need to be very careful about how their participants are thinking about the business opportunity that's been in front of them. And then the sort of biggest point is that even when a product could be marketed efficiently through a recruited network of distributors, unsupported optimism on the part of participants could allow the firm to set prices and rewards such that the average return across participants is negative. So I'll stop there because it looks like Moira is going to give me the hook. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stivers. So Professor William Keep is going to have a look at the Q&A for us. If all of our participants and panelists could just turn back on their cameras. Bill, what have you got for us?
Well, we've got a range of questions and comments. I'm going to try to go back to Stacy's first. A couple of things. First of all, there was a question about, you mentioned further replication. How many times has it been replicated so far was one question.
Yes, so it's only been with the university students and then in Mechanical Turk.
Okay, and the second thing is, and I don't know if we can do this quickly, but maybe people had a hard time reading your blue, red, and orange lines on that chart towards the end.
Oh, they did. That's sad. Yeah, so I mean, basically, it did bring people into 4 different groups. Again, basically low adopters throughout the period, early adopters. So people who, again, counties that took it up quite quickly, but then it saturated and fell off. And then the groups that responded to the Great Recession. And so there was the low recession group. So the uptake really coincided with the Great Recession, but not in a dramatic fashion. And then the high recession group, where they responded very much to the Great Recession in very strong ways.
So in other words, the external economic environment had a big impact, at least on some portion of the group study.
Right. I think it's one of the open questions that, a lot of us get asked a lot, which is, you know, is this really a countercyclical industry or is it not? What, you know, what kind of economic conditions give rise to more participation or not? And I think the general answer we have to give is it's an open question. It's something that has to be continue to be studied, in particular, because just because I can demonstrate that it might have occurred in Fortune high-tech marketing does not indicate that it would occur generally.
Claudia, one question was, in terms of accountability, would a bill that included no purchase necessary requirement for distributors, they were not required to purchase or maintain purchase behavior, would you think something like that might improve accountability?
I think it would help a little. It's like with these income disclosures, you know, some people who read it would realize, okay, I don't have to do it. But I think that this internal buying, I don't even want to use the term consumption, has so many functions that such a note on a disclaimer would not work. Because the function is to show to others that you believe in the product, that you believe in yourself. Yeah, you buy the big bunch because this is your new business. You want to show to your future downline that you believe, and you need to educate yourself. You know, the MLMs have this idea that everyone and no one needs an education, so you educate yourself by buying products and using them. Yeah, and all this would not be covered by a disclaimer. So I think it might help if people get a starter kit to show to others for product sales, yeah, for free or very easily. And then when they give parties, the products are only ordered at the end of the party. That is what some companies do. Yeah, so you don't need to stockpile for selling.
Right.
Yeah. So this could help.
In your somehow I'm echoing. In your model, a questioner noted there's a player that's not modeled that seems to have an impact, and that's like an external endorser or influencer.
Yeah,
and
I think that that influencers work very similarly, you know, so they hope to sell, they sell a dream. So I see great similarities between influencing and the problems with it and multi-level marketing, because it's not based on this rational evaluation, can I make money and how realistic it is to make money, but it's more selling the dream and the hope, and some make it, and those who make it or pretend to have made it, they show on social media how great their lifestyle is in Dubai, for example. That's in Germany. Many Germans have emigrated to Dubai and show off how they made it. Yeah, and we don't know about the figures and all this, so I see very much similarities here.
And it's an accountability issue in terms of
absolutely, that you can't check as a consumer. You can't check. You just don't know. You know, it might be all fake. You have no idea. But selling dreams seems to work.
Well, it seems that Heidi, you inspired to somebody to ask about entry-level books on behavioral economics.
Yeah, so I guess I would say that Nudge is one of my favorites. Full disclosure, I worked on that book. Thinking Fast and Slow is also a really, I think, comprehensive book with a lot of examples across a bunch of different fields. Stacy, do you want to add some more? Those are kind of the first two I think of.
Well, I think the Undoing Project is a really fun narrative description of some of the early foundational work in that area and sort of how it emerged through their intellectual relationship. So if you want kind of a really fun, nice read of how some of the early ideas emerged, that's a nice one too.
Yeah. Even in the mid to late 80s, even in marketing PhD programs, we were reading Kahneman and Tversky, which of course is behind Thinking Fast and Slow. One question here, Heidi, is what should be disclosed to overcome present bias, and how can you drive that information?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And Sort of the comparison that I see with MLMs is with other financial, well, what I would consider not other, but financial products generally, right? And consumer protection. And so, probably the most analogous sort of regulation or legislation I see is maybe the 2009 Credit Card Act, which standardized disclosures around credit card bills for consumers. That said, there are a couple studies that really look into the effects of that on detail. And so I'll talk a little bit about the cons. The first thing is that, when you have disclosures, um, those groups that are bad actors might try to structure their incentives in a way to, I think, evade those disclosures. And so you can see, for instance, as a parallel in the Credit Card Act, basically they shifted fees to areas that weren't asked to be disclosed. And so like a lot of back end fees. The second thing too is that there has been some literature around how you might keep people from more predatory credit card loans. And so folks say that, information disclosures are not perfect, but where we might see that going in is with personalized disclosures. We think that telling people how people who are similar to them have have done in the past seems to be a lot more effective than giving averages. You know, it's not just disclosure. I think that is an issue. I think it's just really availability of data. I think everyone, I don't think it's a hard point to say that we want people to be engaged data consumers. And the easiest way to do that is to sort of have data that is available and relatively low cost to provide.
And I guess this is kind of from me as part of a follow-up to that question. Is it your impression that there's data that could be made available that isn't?
I think that's probably true, right? We know that in order to buy inventory, and in order to get the money that you get from MLMs, that there has to be some sort of data set out there in terms of what people are making. And so I don't think that it is necessarily a hard lift to aggregate that data.
Thank you. And Andrew, the this actually came up a little bit earlier. Your talk about the model and people's expectations came a little bit later, but the question was: is there an MLM that pays attention to supply and demand and tells recruits not to further recruit based on a perception of supply and demand? We've already heard different comments about sort of the all against all competition that can take place there. But are you aware of any supply and demand issues that come into play?
Obviously, I haven't looked at many, frankly, just the ones that have kind of come across our prow here at the FTC. So I don't know. To the extent that they are, I would think that would be a helpful risk mitigative factor. Yeah, I mean, I don't need to kind of re-point out the issue. If you want to open a fast food franchise and you go and ask the other people that are fast food franchisers, hey, is there a great market here? They're not going to oversell it, right? Because they don't want you opening in their neighborhood. But if you're asking the people who are likely to make money if you enter the marketplace, they're going to tell you a rosier picture potentially. So having some safeguards there in terms of what the actual demand is a potential avenue for alleviating some risk.
Thank you. We have a question here. I'm just going to read this question for anybody who, in terms of academic research, would it be more beneficial to tailor studies to existing legal definitions of prohibited conduct or to research general theory to help create a new definition of illegality?
Well, I'm gonna jump right in on that and say that I think it's useful to take a step back from the legal constructs, as I think Heidi definitely mentioned, and I think Stacy and Claudia as well. The legal construct is going to be country specific, but the important thing, and really what our work was influenced by, is what is the fundamental practice that's harmful, regardless of what you might call it or how you might decide what the right legal framework is. So I would strongly encourage people to think about set aside some of the labels and just think about what is this set of practices and how does it affect people. But at the same time, my colleagues in the FTC who are actually bringing these cases might have a different view of emphasizing the legal.
And also, for anybody who would care to answer, we have in the earlier session this morning heard a lot about MLM and direct selling as an alternative retail channel. Someone asks here, maybe MLM is not about retail. Does the MLM model conflict with traditional retail?
I think a lot of MLM is not about retail. And what we need to actually show that better would be better insights, numbers about how big is the share of internal buying. Yeah, so because how much is actually retail to people outside the company. And the conflict with other retailers, I think it arises when MLM gets big. So it really depends on the area. Yeah. So for many parts, it's rather small, I would say. Yeah. But it can happen, for example, for nutritional supplements, which are kind of hype. Everyone wants to be healthy. Yeah. That the share is really big. So I think as long as it's a small part for a certain industry, for a certain product, it's not such a big conflict. But if it takes a bigger share, then conflicts might arise.
Okay. And I think we have time for one or two more. This one also is for Claudia. What is your opinion on the behavior of distributors switching roles back and forth between being a friend and a business owner? It's this friendship relationship, and I'm sure that some of the other panelists may have an opinion on this friendship relationship zone where they like to hide so they feel they do not have to conduct business ethically.
Yeah, I think really MLM uses friendships, and in many cultures that's seen critical. Yeah, that people don't want their friends to talk about business on a birthday party. Yeah, and this happens all the time, and it's put forward as something that is the strength of social selling, also with social media and influencers, that if you have a connection, then you can easily sell products. As the numbers, the earnings are that low, I see that very critically. Yeah, because if people really would promote an opportunity that works, that might have something positive. But as so many people invest more than they earn back, I think it's really rather a risk of misusing relationships. And people really mail me about how they have lost their friends to MLM.
I've received same kind of emails for a long time.
I might just name check Naomi Yannicka, who has done a really nice piece of academic work for a master's, which she's looking to publish, I think, which when she considers expectancy violation theory, and sort of how the term used is Hun zoning is the kind of the term that's used on anti-MLM groups, and how people feel, particularly women feel, about their female friendships being commodified in this way, and how it's very hurtful to people often, especially if they're approached at a time where they're vulnerable. And I think I'll be talking
one
about
last
that tomorrow.
question, and then we have to go to break. And that is, do we have any examples of, or do we have any sense of MLM companies that have reached market saturation? How many participants does it usually take to achieve a market saturation, for example, in the United States? And I will just add to that question that I have put out based on DSA data that in fact, direct selling in the United States has been declining as a percent of US retail sales for a few years now. So does anyone have a sense of this notion of saturation?
I can just say that I think what makes that question very difficult is that it's a question of market boundaries. And one of the cautions that I would give is that when you hear people describing their product as so unique as to not be in a set of competitors, sort of creating a new, suggesting that saturation is impossible because they're so unique, right, as to be wholly differentiated, or basically describing their demand is unlimited. I think this entire group would suggest that the economics rules do still apply to this industry, and so those are areas of caution. I think in terms of actually defining this, another thing that's really hard is that is the product, right, depending on the nature of the way this is being promoted, is the competitive class the actual product or service that the MLM is providing, or is the competitive class other MLM firms that they are competing against based on differentiated compensation plans? And when you look at, for example, reporting of public MLM firms, you will often see that they define their own competitive class as other MLMs, suggesting that it's a question of differentiated compensation plans. So all these things make it very difficult to I think, answer a question directly that you pose.
Thank you very much. I'm done.
Thank you, everyone. It was wonderful to see everybody, and thank you so much for talking us through your work. Having read work from all of you, having you explain it to us is a really a treat. I think we have a break now. I can't see the schedule, but I believe we do. Bill has the schedule.
We do a 10-minute break.
10 minutes. Okay, just enough time to make a cup of tea or coffee, everybody.